as Nikita Khrushchev once remarked, the survivors will envy the dead. This is the grim shadow that has hung over our world now for 80 years, since the US first used the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we've heard already, and of course everybody knows, on the 6th of August 1945, it was a US Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber, macabrely named after the captain's mother, Enola Gay, that first dropped Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever used in combat on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the US dropped the second, Fat Man, on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing at least 100,000 people immediately between the two attacks, and perhaps twice as many slowly in the months and years that followed. Victims of, as we've been hearing, the enduring effects of radiation, which deforms our cells, but also corrupts our very biology. When the first bombs fell, Japan had already been devastated. The US firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100,000 people in a single night back in March, displacing a further 1 million people. The bombing of Osaka destroyed 8 square miles of that city in one air raid. Some 100 Japanese cities were devastated or destroyed entirely before the little boy was even loaded onto Enola Gay. Historical records suggest that the news of the bombings did little to change the political calculus of the Japanese rulers. Transcripts of political discussions from the time suggest that it was the Soviet Union's declaration of war on the morning of August the 9th that turned the tide. Back in the US, as you can imagine, news of the bombing provoked initially widespread outrage. In response, Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson helped advance the narrative that the attack was necessary in order to save more lives and end the war. And I'm sure we've all heard that whole story before. But Stimson knew the truth, which was that US President at the time, Harry S. Truman, had spoken of the bomb as a hammer against the Soviet Union. In July 1945, he approached Joseph Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, telling him that the US had, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, less than 2 weeks later, was an imperial power play as well as a chilling exercise in mass murder, a chance for the US to assert its might and a warning to all those who might challenge it. As Nelson Mandela said, in Japanese, Mandela said, they were aimed against the Soviet Union to say, look, this is the power that we have. If you dare oppose what we do, this is what's going to happen to you. This set the stage for the Cold War, a war so far-reaching in its implications that some historians have called it World War III. It is particularly inappropriate to call a war cold that begins in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, wrote the Italian historian Domenico Losurdo. Even though the US and the USSR never fought directly, Losurdo argued, the ever-present threat of total annihilation would distort the entire political and economic fabric of the world. From Korea to Vietnam, from China to Iran, the US has repeatedly used the threat of nuclear warfare to advance its diplomatic and military objectives, pushing the world increasingly towards nuclear proliferation. The atomic bomb's capacity for total destruction looms over society today. For several decades now, the US has shifted from the initial doctrine based on the idea of mutually assured destruction to one which says no one can win a nuclear war, to one based on counterforce power, which assumes that the US could dismantle any rival's nuclear capacities with a massive first strike. While most nuclear-armed states reserve the right to use nuclear weapons only defensively, the US has not felt bound by such limits. In 2022, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, warned that the US would use atomic weapons, quote, in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States, its allies, and its partners. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remind us that this is no empty threat and what the consequences of it really are. And the US, as we know, remains the only country in history to have deployed nuclear weapons in war, and its interests extend across the globe. Just last week, in fact this week, the US was threatening Brazil with economic and military responses to decisions taken in the Brazilian courts. So I'll just finish with this. On this gruesome 80th anniversary of those nuclear bombings, we can of course do and must remember those that lost their lives in those attacks, all of those that have lost their lives in war since, all of the many people who are losing their lives in war and man-made famine today. But we are not powerless in the face of this destruction. We can, as everybody is doing here and beyond, work together to build sufficient power to counter the war machine of imperialism which is slaying people in their millions around the world and has done every year of the 80 years since the dropping of Little Boy and Fat Man. And the only way to do so, the only real way to dismantle that war machine that threatens all of our lives, is to work with each other across borders to build a diplomacy of peoples that can secure meaningful peace and justice for all of us. Everything, really everything, is at stake in that project.